The howling wind through Deadman's Pass nearly drowned out her scream as Madeline Shaw's horse spooked, sending her dangerously close to the cliff edge. The year was 1876, and the unforgiving Colorado mountains cared nothing for a woman traveling alone, no matter how urgent her mission. Tanner Flynn had been tracking a wounded mountain lion when he heard it, a human cry cutting through the natural sounds of the wilderness. Instinct took over as he rounded the bend to see a chestnut mare rearing wildly and a woman in a dark green riding dress sliding towards certain death on the crumbling edge of the pass. Without hesitation, Tanner uncoiled his lasso from his saddle, swung it with practiced precision, and cast it through the air just as the woman's boots lost their final purchase on the rocky soil. The rope snaked around her waist, pulling taut as her body dropped over the edge. The sudden weight nearly yanked Tanner from his own mount, but he held fast, muscles straining against the pull of gravity and the woman's life hanging literally in his hands. "Hold on," he shouted, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him over the raging wind. Slowly, methodically, he backed his sturdy paint horse away from the cliff, hauling the rope inch by precious inch until a pair of trembling hands appeared, followed by the ashen face of the most striking woman he'd ever seen. When Madeline was finally on solid ground again, she collapsed, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Her honey-brown hair had come loose from its pins, cascading around shoulders that heaved with each desperate breath. Tanner dismounted and approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her further. "Madam, are you injured?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle despite the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Madeline looked up, meeting the eyes of her rescuer. They were startlingly blue against his sun-darkened skin, framed by crow's feet that spoke of years spent squinting against the harsh western sun. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Instead, she reached out a gloved hand, which he took without hesitation. I cannot thank you enough," she finally managed, her Eastern accent immediately marking her as an outsider in this rugged territory. "No need for thanks, madam. Not many folks use this pass, especially not ladies on their own." He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she wobbled slightly. "Tanner Flynn," he introduced himself, tipping his weathered hat. "Madeline Shaw," she replied, attempting to straighten her disheveled appearance. "I was told this route would save me half a day's journey to Silverton." Tanner's expression darkened. "Whoever told you that did you no favors? Deadman's Pass ain't no place for inexperienced riders. There's a reason it's got that name." She bristled slightly at his assessment. "I assure you, Mr. Flynn, I am quite accomplished on horseback. It was merely that something spooked my horse." Her eyes darted toward the trail behind them, and for the first time, Tanner noticed the genuine fear in them, fear that wasn't solely due to her near-fatal fall. "Something or someone?" he asked shrewdly. Madeline hesitated, clearly weighing how much to divulge to this stranger who had just saved her life. Before she could decide, a distant crack echoed through the canyon, unmistakably a rifle shot. "Get down," Tanner ordered, pulling her behind a large boulder just as another shot pinged off the rocks where they'd been standing. Her horse, already terrified, bolted down the trail, while Tanner's more experienced mount merely backed away to safer cover. "Who is that?" Madeline whispered, her breath warm against Tanner's neck as they pressed against the rocky shelter. "I was hoping you might tell me," he replied grimly, carefully drawing his Winchester from its scabbard. "Seems like you've made yourself some enemies, Miss Shaw." "It's Mrs. Shaw, actually," she corrected automatically, then bit her lip. "And yes, I fear you're right." Tanner's eyes narrowed at both the revelation of her marital status and the confirmation of his suspicions. "Where's your husband?" "Dead," she answered flatly. "And the men who killed him are likely the ones trying to ensure I don't reach Silverton alive." Another shot rang out, closer this time, chipping stone fragments that scattered over them. Tanner peered cautiously around the edge of their shelter, then ducked back quickly. "2 riders, maybe 3, he reported. "We're pinned down here, and they've got the high ground." He glanced at her torn dress and impractical boots. "Can you ride astride if need be?" Madeline nodded firmly. "I can ride however necessary to stay alive, Mr. Flynn." A half-smile tugged at his mouth. "Good. When I give the signal, run for my horse. I'll provide covering fire, then join you. We'll have to double up, but Samson can handle it." She nodded again, gathering her skirts in preparation. Tanner counted silently, then fired 3 rapid shots toward their attackers before shouting, "Now!" Madeline ran, dodging between sparse cover as bullets kicked up dust around her feet. She reached the paint horse and managed to pull herself into the saddle despite her cumbersome clothing. Moments later, Tanner appeared beside her, swinging up behind her in one fluid motion. His arm reached around her to grab the reins, and they were off, racing down a narrow trail that veered away from the main pass. "Where are we going?" she called over her shoulder as they galloped, the sound of pursuit fading slightly behind them. "There's an old mining camp about 4 miles east. We can lose them in the abandoned tunnels if need be," Tanner replied, his body warm and solid against her back. "Hold tight." They rode hard for nearly an hour, Tanner occasionally taking them through streams or doubling back to confuse their trail. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, with pine forests giving way to bare rock and finally to the weathered remains of a once bustling mining operation. Tanner guided his horse between dilapidated structures, finally stopping in the shadow of what had once been an assay office. The log building was missing half its roof, but the walls were intact, and it offered reasonable shelter as the afternoon light began to fade. "We'll rest here," he decided, helping Madeline dismount. Her legs nearly buckled after the hard ride, and he caught her elbow to steady her. "Are you all right?" "Yes, just. It's been quite a day." She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Inside the old office, Tanner quickly assessed their situation. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, and there was enough broken furniture to provide kindling. He worked efficiently, starting a small, smokeless fire while Madeline sank onto a bench, finally allowing herself to feel the full impact of her near-death experience. "Thank you," she said softly as he handed her a canteen. "Not just for saving me at the cliff, but for this, for helping me when you have no obligation to do so." Tanner settled on a crate across from her, his rugged features illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Out here, we help each other. That's how folks survive." He paused, studying her face. "But I think it's time you told me what kind of trouble you're in, Mrs. Shaw. Those men weren't just random bandits." Madeline took a long drink of water, then capped the canteen. She straightened her spine, seeming to come to a decision. "My husband, William, was a mining engineer," she began. "We came west from Boston last year when he was hired by the Silverton Mining Company. Everything was going well until 3 months ago, when he discovered irregularities in the company's assay reports. They were salting the samples," Tanner surmised, making the silver deposits seem richer than they were. Madeline's eyebrows rose slightly. "You know about mining?" "Enough. Tried my hand at it before turning to ranching." His tone suggested it hadn't been a successful venture. "So your husband found out they were swindling investors?" "Yes, and he confronted Mr. Blackwell, the company manager." Her voice caught. 3 days later, there was an accident in the mine. William was killed, along with 2 other men. Tanner's jaw tightened, and no one questioned it. "Mining accidents are common enough," she replied bitterly. "But William had shown me proof of what he'd found. Documents, samples. He kept duplicates hidden at our home." Her hands twisted in her lap. "After the funeral, Mr. Blackwell offered to buy our house, said it would be a kindness to spare me the trouble of selling it before returning east." "But you didn't go east," Tanner observed. "No. I knew if they wanted the house so badly, it must be because they feared William had evidence there. I searched until I found it, hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards." A determined light entered her eyes. "I'm taking it to the federal marshal in Silverton. There's a territorial judge arriving next week who can't be bought by the mining companies." Tanner let out a low whistle. "So you're carrying evidence that could ruin some powerful men. Men who've already killed once and won't hesitate to do so again," she agreed grimly. "I thought I'd been careful, slipping away before dawn. But they must have been watching the house. And they knew you'd take the shortcut through the pass," Tanner concluded. "It's isolated, perfect for an accident." Madeline shivered despite the fire's warmth. "If you hadn't come along when you did." "But I did," he said simply. He rose and moved to the doorway, scanning the darkening landscape. "Night's coming on fast. We should be safe here until morning, but we'll need to keep watch." Madeline stood as well, brushing dust from her torn dress. "I can take a turn. I know how to shoot, Mr. Flynn." He turned to look at her, reassessing this Boston woman who had already shown more grit than many men he'd known. Tanner, he corrected. If we're going to be dodging bullets together, you might as well use my first name. She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her face. Very well, Tanner. And I'm Madeline. As night fell fully over the abandoned mining camp, they settled into an uneasy vigilance. Tanner insisted Madeline rest first while he kept watch, promising to wake her in a few hours. Too exhausted to argue, she arranged her cloak as a makeshift bed near the fire and was asleep almost instantly. Tanner watched her from his post by the window, wondering at the strange turn his day had taken. He'd set out to track a mountain lion and instead found himself protecting a widow with a dangerous secret. There was something about her that intrigued him, not just her beauty, though that was considerable, but the steel beneath her refined exterior. The night passed without incident, and when the first gray light of dawn filtered through the broken roof, Tanner roused Madeline gently. We should move before full light, he advised. Silverton's still a good day's ride from here, especially doubling up on Sampson. Madeline nodded, quickly pinning up her hair and brushing off her dress as best she could. What route will we take? They'll be watching the main roads. I know these mountains better than most, Tanner replied, saddling his horse. There are hunting trails that don't appear on any maps. It'll be rough going, but we should reach town by nightfall if we're lucky. They set out as the sun crested the eastern peaks, Madeline once again seated in front of Tanner on his sturdy paint. The closeness was unavoidable, and both were acutely aware of the other's presence, her back against his chest, his arms on either side of her holding the reins. As they rode, Tanner pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the land they traversed. He'd come to Colorado Territory as a young man after the war between the states, seeking something he couldn't quite name. 10 years later, he had a modest ranch outside of Durango and a reputation as one of the best trackers in the region. Is that how you happened to be on the pass yesterday? Madeline asked. Tracking. Mountain lion took one of my calves, he explained. Been following it for 2 days. Never did get a clean shot. I'm sorry I interrupted your hunt, she said sincerely. Tanner chuckled, the sound rumbling against her back. I'd say saving you was worth more than a scrawny mountain cat. They paused at midday by a clear stream to rest the horse and eat some jerky Tanner had in his saddlebags. Madeline washed her face and hands in the cold water, feeling more like herself despite her bedraggled appearance. You said you have a ranch, she remarked as they sat in the dappled shade. Do you have family there? A shadow crossed Tanner's face. No. Just me and a couple of hands during calving season. My wife died of fever 5 years back. I'm sorry, Madeline said softly, recognizing the familiar grief in his voice. It doesn't really get easier, does it? Just different. Different, he agreed, meeting her eyes with understanding. That's a good word for it. Their moment of connection was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Tanner was on his feet instantly, helping Madeline up and leading her to where Sampson was tethered. Could be innocent travelers, he whispered, but I'm not willing to bet your life on it. They mounted quickly and rode into the deeper forest, following a game trail that wound between massive pines. The hoofbeats grew louder, then began to fade as whoever was following them apparently took a different path. They're searching the area, Tanner surmised. They must have tracked us to the mining camp. Madeline's hands tightened on the pommel. How many do you think there are? At least 4, maybe more. Blackwell wouldn't spare any expense to silence you. He guided the horse through a particularly dense section of forest. We need to change our plan. They'll have men watching all approaches to Silverton. But the marshal will get to him, Tanner assured her. But not the way they're expecting. As the afternoon wore on, they climbed higher into the mountains, the trail becoming so steep in places that they had to dismount and lead Sampson. Madeline struggled with her long skirts, but never complained, even when thorns tore at the fabric and scratched her hands. Where exactly are we going? She asked as they paused on a rocky outcropping. Below them, the valley stretched out, a patchwork of forests and meadows. There's an old trapper's cabin near the headwaters of the Amidst, Tanner explained. Friend of mine uses it sometimes. We can rest there tonight, then circle around to approach Silverton from the north at dawn. They won't be expecting that. The sun was setting when they finally reached the cabin, a sturdy if humble structure nestled in a small clearing. Inside, it was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall. "It's not what you're used to, I expect," Tanner said apologetically as he lit the oil lamp hanging from a ceiling beam. Madeline smiled tiredly. "After nearly falling to my death and being shot at, a roof and walls seemed positively luxurious." While Tanner tended to his horse, Madeline explored the cabin, finding some dried beans and salt pork in a well-sealed tin. By the time he returned, she had a pot of beans simmering over the fire and was attempting to mend the worst tears in her dress with a needle and thread she'd found. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Shaw," Tanner remarked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Madeline," she corrected him, "and I wasn't always a mining engineer's wife in Boston. I grew up in western Pennsylvania, where girls learn practical skills alongside their needlepoint." They shared a simple but filling meal, the close quarters of the cabin creating an intimacy that neither acknowledged directly. As they washed the few dishes, their hands brushed occasionally, each touch sending an unexpected current between them. "You should take the bed," Tanner said as they prepared for night. "I'll be fine by the fire." Madeline looked at the narrow cot, then back at Tanner's tall frame. "That's generous, but hardly fair. You've done all the hard work of getting us here." "I insist," he said firmly. "My ma raised me to be a gentleman, even if I don't always look the part." Madeline didn't argue further, too exhausted to debate the point. She settled on the bed, pulling a worn quilt over herself fully clothed, while Tanner arranged his bedroll near the hearth. The cabin creaked and settled as the night deepened. Outside, an owl called mournfully, and the wind whispered through the pine boughs. Despite her fatigue, Madeline found herself unable to sleep, too aware of the man lying a few feet away. "Tanner," she whispered, unsure if he was still awake. "Yes." His voice came immediately, suggesting he'd been as restless as she was. "I never properly thanked you for saving my life yesterday, if you hadn't been there with your rope." In the dim light from the banked fire, she saw him shift to face her. "You don't need to thank me, Madeline. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said with certainty. "Not anyone. Most men would have ridden the other way when they realized trouble was following me." She propped herself up on one elbow. "Why didn't you?" Tanner was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "My wife, Caroline. She was traveling alone when she got sick. Stopped at a town where no one would help her because she was a stranger. By the time word reached me, it was too late." His voice roughened. "I swore after that I'd never turn away from someone who needed help, especially not a woman on her own." Madeline's throat tightened with emotion. "She must have been very special." "She was," he agreed softly. "Just like I suspect your husband was." "William was a good man," Madeline said after a moment. "Principled. That's what got him killed, in the end. He couldn't look the other way when he saw corruption. And neither can you," Tanner observed. "Most widows would have taken the money and gone back east." "Most widows didn't promise their dying husbands they would see justice done," she replied, a hint of steel returning to her voice. The conversation lapsed into silence, but it was a comfortable one, built on newfound understanding. Eventually, Madeline drifted to sleep, feeling safer than she had in months despite the dangers still pursuing them. She dreamed of falling, of the wind rushing past her ears as the abyss opened below, but then a rope appeared, strong and sure, pulling her back to solid ground. When she looked up to thank her rescuer, it was Tanner's face she saw, those blue eyes crinkled with concern. Dawn came too soon, gray light filtering through the cabin's single window. Madeline woke to find Tanner already up, tending to a small fire and brewing coffee in a battered pot. "Morning," he greeted her. "Sleep well." "Better than I expected," she admitted, smoothing her hair and accepting the tin cup he offered. The coffee was strong and bitter, but wonderfully warming. "We should reach Silverton by noon if we leave soon," Tanner said, studying a rough map he'd sketched in the dirt floor. "There's a back way into town through the old cemetery. Not many folks use it." Madeline nodded, reaching into her bodice to extract a small oilskin packet. "This is what they're after. William's evidence against Blackwell and the mining company." She carefully unwrapped it, revealing several folded papers and a small leather pouch. Assay reports, ledger entries, and samples of or both the real findings and the salted ones. Tanner examined the documents with a frown. This is serious business. They've been systematically defrauding investors of thousands of dollars. And killing anyone who discovers their scheme, Madeline added grimly. Tanner rewrapped the evidence carefully. You should carry this separately from yourself, in case we're separated. I have a hollow in my saddle horn where it will be safe. They set out as the sun cleared the mountain peaks, the air crisp and clean after a light overnight frost. The trail Tanner chose was barely visible, winding through stands of aspen that had begun to turn golden with the approaching autumn. It's beautiful, Madeline remarked, gazing at the landscape spread before them. Despite everything, I've come to love these mountains. They grow on you, Tanner agreed. First time I saw the Rockies, I knew I'd never be happy anywhere else. They rode in companionable silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts. The events of the past 2 days had created a bond between them that neither fully understood but both felt keenly. As they crested a ridge overlooking a broad valley, Tanner suddenly reined in his horse, his body tensing. What is it? Madeline whispered, alarmed by his change in demeanor. Smoke, he said tersely, pointing to a thin column rising from the trees about half a mile ahead. That's not a campfire too big, and it's right where the trail narrows through a ravine. They've set an ambush, Madeline realized. They must have guessed we'd try to approach from this direction. Tanner nodded grimly. And they've set the forest on fire to force us into their trap. He scanned the terrain, looking for alternatives. We'll have to go around, but it'll add hours to our journey. We don't have hours, Madeline pointed out. The judge arrives tomorrow, and if we don't reach the marshal today. I know. Tanner's mind worked quickly. There's another way, but it's dangerous. The old mining tramway crosses the valley about 2 miles east of here. If it's still intact, we could use it to bypass their ambush entirely. And if it's not intact, his eyes met hers steadily, then we'll have a problem. The decision made, they turned eastward, leaving the established trail for rougher terrain. The smoke grew more visible behind them, suggesting the fire was spreading, whether intentionally set to flush them out or simply a byproduct of the ambush. They couldn't know. The abandoned tramway came into view an hour later, a precarious-looking structure of weathered timber and rusted cables spanning a deep gorge. It had once transported ore from the high mountain mines to the processing facilities in the valley, but had clearly been and used for years. You can't be serious, Madeline said, staring at the dubious conveyance. I wish I weren't, Tanner replied honestly, but our options are limited. The car seems intact, and the cables haven't snapped yet. That's not as reassuring as you might think, she remarked dryly, but there was no real protest in her voice. She understood the necessity. They dismounted, and Tanner led Samson to a sheltered grove nearby. I'm sorry, old friend, he murmured to the horse. We'll come back for you if we can. The tramway station was a simple platform with a hand-cranked mechanism to move the ore car along the cables. Tanner tested the crank cautiously, and to their surprise, it moved with only minimal resistance, the gears inside the housing still functional despite years of neglect. The mining company built things to last back then, he observed. Unlike the current management, it seems. The ore car itself was a basic metal bucket large enough for both of them if they stood close together. Tanner helped Madeline inside, then joined her, taking position at the brake lever. Hold on to me, he instructed. Once we release the brake, gravity will do most of the work. I'll control our speed as best I can. Madeline wrapped her arms around his waist without hesitation. I trust you, she said simply. Those 3 words affected Tanner more profoundly than he expected. He cleared his throat, focusing on the task at hand. Here we go. The brake released with a metallic groan, and the car lurched forward, beginning its descent along the cables. The movement was jerky at first, then smoothed as they gained momentum, the gorge yawning beneath them. Madeline kept her eyes fixed on Tanner's back, unwilling to look down at the dizzying drop below. The wind whipped around them, carrying away her gasp when the car suddenly swayed violently. Just a cross-current, Tanner called over his shoulder. The cables are holding fine. They were about halfway across when the first shot rang out. Tanner instinctively pulled Madeline lower in the car, scanning the cliffs on either side. They've spotted us, he shouted as another bullet pinged off the metal near their heads. Madeline craned her neck to see 2 riders on the opposite ridge, their rifles glinting in the sunlight. Can we go any faster? Not safely, Tanner grunted, maintaining his grip on the brake. Going too fast could derail them from the cables or cause them to crash into the far station. Another shot came closer, and Madeline felt Tanner jerk against her. You're hit. Just grazed, he assured her through gritted teeth. Keep down. The tramway car continued its inexorable journey across the gorge, seemingly moving slower now that they knew gunmen were tracking them. Madeline could feel warm blood seeping through Tanner's shirt where her hand pressed against his side. Finally, agonizingly, they reached the far station. Tanner applied the brake, bringing them to a halt at the landing platform. He helped Madeline out first, then followed, his movements stiff with pain. We need to keep moving, he said, glancing back at the distant figures who were now descending toward the tramway's far end. They'll try to cross after us. Not if we disable it, Madeline said, already examining the mechanism. With surprising strength, she grabbed a loose metal bar and jammed it into the gears of the winch. That should slow them down. Tanner looked at her with newfound admiration. Remind me never to underestimate you. They hurried down from the tramway station, following a disused mining road that wound toward the valley floor. Tanner's wound was painful but not debilitating. The bullet had indeed only grazed his ribs, though it bled freely enough to concern Madeline. We need to bandage that, she insisted when they paused to catch their breath in the shelter of an outcropping. There's no time, he began, but she was already tearing a strip from her petticoat. There's time for this, she said firmly. You're no good to either of us if you bleed to death. He submitted to her ministrations, watching her face as she concentrated on binding his wound. Her touch was gentle but sure, her fingers brushing against his skin with businesslike efficiency that nonetheless sent his pulse racing. There, she said, securing the makeshift bandage. It's not perfect, but it should hold until we reach Silverton. Thank you, Tanner said, catching her hand before she could withdraw it. Their eyes met and held, something unspoken passing between them. The moment was broken by the distant sound of a cable snapping, the tramway collapsing under the weight of their pursuers. Seems your sabotage was more effective than we thought, Tanner remarked as they listened to shouts of alarm echoing across the gorge. That should buy us some time, Madeline agreed. But Blackwell will have men in Silverton too. We're not safe yet. They continued their journey, the town now visible in the valley below. Silverton was larger than Madeline had expected, a proper settlement with wooden sidewalks, several saloons, and even a hotel with glass windows. But it was the brick building with the U.S. Marshal's office sign that drew her attention. We'll approach from the north, as planned, Tanner said as they skirted the outskirts of town. Stay in the shadows and keep your head down. Your eastern clothes will stand out here. Madeline nodded, suddenly acutely aware of how bedraggled she must look after 2 days in the wilderness. Her once fine dress was torn and dirt-stained, her hair barely contained by the few pins that remained. I hardly think anyone will recognize me as a Boston lady now, she said with grim humor. They entered town through a narrow alley behind the livery stable, keeping to back streets as they made their way toward the marshal's office. Silverton was busy with the usual activities of a mining town, miners coming off shift, merchants closing up shop for the evening, saloon girls beginning their night's work. Almost there, Tanner murmured as they turned onto a side street that would lead them to their destination. They were a mere 50 yards from the marshal's office when a voice called out, "Mrs. Shaw." What a pleasant surprise. Madeline froze, her blood turning to ice as she recognized the smooth, cultured tones. She turned slowly to face Herbert Blackwell, the mining company manager, flanked by 2 burly men with hands resting on holstered pistols. "Mr. Blackwell," she acknowledged coldly. "I wish I could say the same." Blackwell was a dapper man in his 40s, impeccably dressed with a gold watch chain stretched across his vest. His smile never reached his eyes as he surveyed the pair before him. "We've been quite concerned about you," he said, "disappearing from your home without a word. And in the company of this." He eyed Tanner dismissively. "Individual." "Cut the act, Blackwell," Tanner growled, positioning himself slightly in front of Madeline. "We know what you did to William Shaw, and we have proof." A flash of something, anger? Fear? Crossed Blackwell's face before his mask of civility returned. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Poor William died in a tragic accident, as the coroner's report clearly states. The report you paid for, you mean? Madeline shot back. We're taking the evidence to Marshal Donovan right now. Blackwell sighed dramatically. I'm afraid that won't be possible. You see, the marshal is currently investigating a disturbance at the south end of town. Very inconsiderate of those rowdy miners, causing trouble just when we're having this little reunion. The implication was clear. Blackwell had orchestrated a diversion to ensure the marshal would be unavailable. The two men flanking him moved their hands to their gun handles, their intent becoming unmistakable. Now, Blackwell continued pleasantly, if you'll just hand over whatever evidence you think you have, we can conclude our business without unpleasantness. Tanner's hand inched toward his own pistol. There are witnesses all around us, Blackwell. You can't gun us down in the middle of the street. Can't I? Blackwell's smile turned cruel. This is a mining town, Mr. Flynn. Tanner Flynn. Mr. Flynn. In mining towns, accidents happen every day. Two more bodies won't raise many questions, especially when one is a grief-crazed widow and the other her rough accomplice. Madeline felt a chill at the casual way Blackwell discussed their murders. This man had ordered her husband's death and now stood ready to kill again to protect his scheme. What would you gain? She demanded. Even if you kill us, others know about the evidence. It was a bluff they had told no one else, but Blackwell hesitated fractionally, uncertainty crossing his features. That moment of hesitation was all Tanner needed. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and fired, not at Blackwell, but at the oil lamp hanging outside the barber shop next to them. The lamp shattered, spilling burning oil that created an instant barrier of flame between them and Blackwell's group. Run! Tanner shouted, grabbing Madeline's hand and pulling her toward the marshal's office. Shots rang out behind them, bullets splintering the wooden sidewalk at their feet. Townspeople scattered, shouting in alarm at the sudden gunfire. They burst through the door of the marshal's office to find it empty, just as Blackwell had said. Tanner quickly barred the door behind them, scanning the room for options. He was telling the truth about the marshal being gone, Madeline said breathlessly. But he'll be back, Tanner assured her, moving to the windows to secure the shutters. And this is the most defensible building in town. Outside, they could hear Blackwell organizing his men, surrounding the building. More gunshots peppered the walls, wood splintering with each impact. We need to hold out until the marshal returns, Tanner said, checking his ammunition. The evidence is still in my saddle horn, but Samson is back by the tramway. Madeline nodded, her mind racing. There must be weapons here. She began searching the office, finding a shotgun and several boxes of ammunition in a cabinet. Here. Tanner took the shotgun with a grim smile. You continue to surprise me, Mrs. Shaw. Madeline, she corrected automatically, loading a pistol she'd found in the marshal's desk drawer. At his raised eyebrow, she added, my father believed women should know how to defend themselves. A wise man, Tanner commented, taking position at one of the windows. The standoff continued as the afternoon waned into evening. Blackwell's men kept up sporadic fire, testing their defenses but not launching a full assault, yet likely wary of the attention a prolonged gunfight would draw. As darkness fell, Tanner and Madeline took turns keeping watch, their position illuminated only by a single lantern turned low. During a quiet moment, they shared the last of Tanner's jerky, sitting side by side against the wall beneath a window. I'm sorry I got you into this, Madeline said softly. Tanner turned to look at her, his face shadowed in the dim light. You didn't get me into anything. I chose to help you, and I don't regret it. He hesitated, then added, not for a moment. Something in his voice made Madeline's heart beat faster. Despite their dire circumstances, she was acutely aware of his proximity, of the way his shoulder pressed against hers, warm and reassuring. When this is over, she began, but stopped, unsure how to continue. When this is over, Tanner said quietly, I'd like to know you better, Madeline Shaw. If you're willing. Before she could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. New voices were shouting, and the gunfire had ceased. Tanner moved cautiously to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. It's the marshal, he announced with relief. And he's got deputies with him. They opened the door carefully to find Marshal Donovan and several armed men confronting Blackwell and his henchmen in the street. What in tarnation is going on here? The marshal demanded, his weathered face set in hard lines. Blackwell says you two are dangerous fugitives. That's a lie. Madeline stepped forward. I'm Madeline Shaw, widow of William Shaw. We have evidence that Mr. Blackwell and the Silverton Mining Company have been defrauding investors and that they murdered my husband to cover it up. Marshal Donovan's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation, madam. And we can prove it, Tanner added. But the evidence is with my horse, north of town by the old tramway. Preposterous. Blackwell blustered. This woman is deranged with grief, and this man is clearly taking advantage of her condition. Then you won't mind if we retrieve this alleged evidence, the marshal countered. Jenkins, escort Mr. Flynn to his horse. The rest of you, keep these gentlemen right here until they return. Despite Blackwell's protests, the marshal's authority held. Tanner departed with the deputy, returning an hour later with Sampson in tow and the precious oilskin packet in hand. By then, a crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Among them was Judge Harmon, who had arrived in town earlier than expected. When Madeline presented William's evidence, the falsified assay reports, the doctored ledgers, the samples proving the fraud, the judge's expression grew increasingly grave. These documents appear authentic, he declared after examining them carefully, and they detail a massive fraud. Marshal, I believe you should take Mr. Blackwell and his associates into custody pending a formal investigation. Blackwell's face contorted with rage as deputies moved to arrest him. You'll regret this, he spat at Madeline. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, she replied steadily. A murderer who's finally facing justice. As Blackwell was led away, the tension that had sustained Madeline for so long suddenly evaporated. She swayed slightly, and Tanner was immediately at her side, supporting her with a gentle hand at her elbow. It's over, he said softly. You did it. William would be proud. Tears filled her eyes for the first time since this ordeal began. We did it, she corrected him. I never would have made it without you. The marshal approached, hat in hand. Mrs. Shaw, I owe you an apology. There were rumors about irregularities at the mining company, but without proof. He shook his head regretfully. If I'd investigated more thoroughly, your husband might still be alive. You couldn't have known, she said graciously. What matters is that justice will be done now. Indeed it will, Judge Harmon assured her, joining their conversation. Based on this evidence, I'll convene a grand jury immediately, and there will be a full investigation into your husband's death. In the days that followed, Silverton buzzed with the scandal. Additional witnesses came forward, emboldened by Blackwell's arrest, and the full extent of the mining company's corruption was revealed. The investigation into William's death was reopened, with the coroner now acknowledging that what had appeared to be a mining accident showed signs of deliberate sabotage. Throughout it all, Tanner remained at Madeline's side, a steady presence as she navigated the legal proceedings and the renewed grief of revisiting her husband's murder. They took rooms at the Silverton Hotel separately, of course, proprieties still holding even in the wake of their shared ordeal. One evening, a week after their dramatic arrival in town, Tanner found Madeline on the hotel's small veranda, watching the sunset paint the surrounding mountains in shades of gold and purple. Penny for your thoughts, he said, joining her at the railing. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. I was thinking how beautiful it is here. And how strange that in the midst of tragedy and danger, I found a place that feels more like home than Boston ever did. Tanner studied her profile, admiring the strength in her delicate features. Will you go back east now? Your mission is accomplished. Madeline turned to face him fully. I've been asking myself the same question. There's nothing for me in Boston anymore. My parents are gone, and William's family. She hesitated. They never approved of me. Said he married beneath his station. Fools, Tanner said simply. Her smile widened. Perhaps. But the question remains, what now? Where do I go from here? There was a vulnerability in her question that touched Tanner deeply. He took a breath, gathering his courage. You could stay, he suggested quietly. Colorado territory has need of strong women. My ranch outside Durango isn't much, but it's peaceful, beautiful in its own way. Madeline's eyes widened slightly. Tanner Flynn, are you asking me to come live on your ranch? Not exactly, he said, his voice roughening. I'm asking if you might consider allowing me to court you properly. We met under unusual circumstances, to say the least, but I've come to admire you more than any woman I've known since Caroline. He took her hand gently. I'm not proposing marriage, not yet. That would be too soon for both of us. But I am proposing a beginning. Madeline looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Tanner's face. The setting sun highlighted the earnest hope in his blue eyes, and she felt something unfurl in her heart, something she had thought died with William. A beginning, she repeated softly. Yes, I think I would like that very much. Tanner's smile was like the sunrise after the longest night. Then, that's settled, he said, bringing her hand to his lips in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply sincere. They remained on the veranda until the stars emerged, talking of small things and large, his ranch, her life before Boston, their shared love of the mountains. It was the first of many such conversations as spring turned to summer and their courtship blossomed under the vast Colorado sky. Blackwell and his accomplices were convicted that autumn, the evidence Madeline had preserved proving irrefutable in court. Justice for William was bittersweet, bringing closure but also reopening wounds that had just begun to heal. I'll always love him, Madeline told Tanner one evening as they rode along the ridge overlooking his ranch. He was a good man who died for his principles. I would never ask you to forget him, Tanner replied. Just as I'll always remember Caroline. They helped make us who we are. By winter, Madeline had settled into a small cabin on the edge of Tanner's property, close enough for daily visits, but maintaining a proper distance that satisfied the neighbors' sense of decorum. She started a small school for the children of nearby ranchers, finding joy in teaching that she hadn't anticipated. When spring returned to the mountains, bringing wildflowers and new calves to the ranch, Tanner rode to her cabin one morning with a special purpose. He found her in the garden she'd started, dirt smudging her cheeks as she planted seedlings in the newly thawed soil. You're out early, she observed, smiling up at him. The year in Colorado had changed her. Her skin was sun-kissed now, her movements more confident, her Eastern reserve softened by Western practicality. Couldn't sleep, he admitted, dismounting. Too much on my mind. Madeline stood, brushing soil from her hands. Anything you care to share? Instead of answering directly, Tanner reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. I carved this, he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice as he handed it to her. Not as fine as something from a Boston jeweler, but Madeline opened the box to find a ring nestled inside, a simple silver band set with a small but perfect blue stone that matched Tanner's eyes. It's turquoise, he explained. Found it myself last summer in the hills beyond the north pasture. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the ring. It's beautiful. Tanner took a deep breath. Madeline Shaw, this year has been the happiest I've known in a long time. You brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever. He took her hand in his. I'm asking now what I couldn't ask a year ago. Will you marry me? Tears sparkled in Madeline's eyes as she looked up at the man who had saved her in more ways than one. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you, Tanner Flynn. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into an embrace that held all the promise of their future together. They were married in June beneath the aspens on Tanner's now their ranch, with the mountains standing witness. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by friends they'd made over the past year, including Marshall Donovan and several families whose children Madeline taught. As they exchanged vows, both acknowledged silently the journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey that began with danger and desperation on a mountain pass, but had transformed into something neither could have imagined when Tanner's rope caught Madeline just before she fell. I will never regret that day on Deadman's Pass, Madeline told Tanner that night as they stood on the porch of their home, watching stars emerge above the darkening mountains. As terrible as it was, it led me to you. Seems fitting, Tanner replied, his arm warm around her shoulders. A place named for death bringing us both back to life. In the years that followed, the Flynn Ranch prospered under their joint care. Madeline's school grew into a proper building with multiple teachers, providing education to children across the county. Tanner's skills as a rancher and tracker made him a respected figure in the region, often called upon to help newcomers navigate the challenges of Western life. They had 2 children, a son with Madeline's honey-brown hair and determination, and a daughter who inherited Tanner's blue eyes and quiet strength. Together, they built a life that honored both their pasts while embracing their shared future. Sometimes, on clear evenings, they would ride up to the ridge overlooking their valley, the same spot where they had paused during their flight from Blackwell's men years before. There, with the world spread before them, they would remember how close they had come to never finding each other at all, how a moment's difference on a mountain pass might have changed everything. Do you ever think about how many small chances had to align? Madeline asked once as they watched the sunset from that special place. You deciding to track that mountain lion on that particular day, me choosing that route to Silverton. I don't believe it was chance, Tanner said, his voice soft but certain. Some things are meant to be, even if the path getting there is harder than we'd choose. Madeline leaned against him, grateful for the solid strength that had become the foundation of her new life. From Deadman's past to here, she mused. Quite a journey. And it's not over yet, Tanner promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. Not by a long shot. As they rode home in the gathering dusk, side by side as they had been since that fateful day, they carried with them the knowledge that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its greatest challenges, and that love, once found, is worth every risk taken to preserve it. In the shadow of the Colorado mountains, with the past honored but not binding them, Tanner and Madeline Flynn continued writing their story together, a story that began with a slip, a rope, and a rescue, but grew into something far more enduring than either could have imagined when their paths first crossed on that dangerous mountain pass.